The silence starts in the body before it ever becomes a decision. It sits in your chest when you look at the phone and do not touch it. It sits in your throat when you want to explain yourself one more time, soften one more edge, send one more message that says, "No, really, I meant well." It sits in the hands too, the hands that used to reach first, the hands that used to rescue, clarify, repair, chase, soothe. And now they are still. That stillness can feel strange at first, almost wrong, especially if you have spent years believing that being good meant being available, that being loving meant being easy to reach, that being kind meant never letting discomfort linger too long. So when you stop answering instantly, when you stop filling every gap, when you stop turning every silence into your responsibility, something inside you may whisper, "This feels cruel." But that feeling is not always truth. Sometimes guilt is just the sound of an old role losing its grip. That is the part most people miss. They think the pain comes from the other person's reaction, the coldness, the confusion, the sudden shift in tone, the way they seem to notice your distance only when you stop offering yourself so freely. But the deeper pain is often older than the relationship in front of you, older than the argument, older than the last message left unread. The deeper pain is the terror of no longer being needed in the same way. For some people, that is where the whole structure begins to wobble. Because if your sense of value was built around being the one who understands, the one who calms, the one who stays, then silence can feel like you are erasing yourself. And yet, if you keep speaking when your body is begging you to stop, if you keep explaining when your spirit is already exhausted, then you are not loving. You are disappearing in slow motion. Carl Jung would have recognized the pattern immediately, even if he would have used different words for different lives. He would have looked at the role, the mask, the hidden need beneath the mask, and the emotional charge that keeps repeating itself until it becomes visible. Because what you call being nice is sometimes a persona, a socially acceptable face that learned, long ago, that peace had to be purchased with self-abandonment. And once that persona is strong enough, silence becomes unbearable for the people around you. Not because you were doing anything dramatic, not because you were punishing them, but because your silence removes the fuel that kept the old pattern alive. This is where the confusion begins. You stop over-explaining, and suddenly they act as if you have changed into someone colder. You say less, and suddenly your calm is interpreted as distance. You protect your energy, and suddenly they are the injured one. That reversal can shake you, especially if you are an empath, especially if you are someone who has spent years reading the room before reading yourself. You may start asking, am I being unfair? Am I becoming hard? Am I turning into the kind of person I used to fear? But there is another possibility. Maybe what feels like coldness is simply the nervous system finally refusing to keep bleeding for a dynamic that never learned how to hold you gently. There is a difference between shutting down and setting a boundary. They may look similar from the outside. Both can be quiet. Both can be brief. Both can feel like distance to someone who is used to your constant emotional labor. But inside, they are not the same at all. Shutting down is what happens when you are overwhelmed and cannot feel your own center anymore. A boundary is what happens when you can still feel your center and choose to protect it. That is why your silence matters. Not as a tactic, not as a game, not as a way to make someone chase you, but as a line in the sand that says, "I will no longer confuse access with intimacy." That sentence can change everything, because access is cheap. Intimacy is not. Access means someone can reach you whenever they want, even if they have not earned the right to be close. Intimacy means mutuality, timing, respect, responsibility. A real meeting between two inner worlds, not one person endlessly adapting while the other remains unchanged. And if you have been living in a pattern where you are always the one to soften, always the one to repair, always the one to keep the emotional climate stable, then your silence will feel like a shock to the system. Not only theirs, yours too. You may feel the urge to fill it, to send the message, to explain the boundary so well that no one can misunderstand it, to make your silence nice enough that nobody can accuse you of being mean. But a boundary does not need to apologize for existing. That is a hard lesson for someone whose whole identity was built around being understandable. The empathic personality often develops a strange survival skill. It becomes fluent in other people's moods. It anticipates, translates, absorbs, and smooths. It notices the tension before anyone speaks. It feels responsible for the room, the relationship, the family, the group, the atmosphere. And because this skill is rewarded early, it can become a trap later. You learn to be the one who never adds pressure. You learn to be the one who stays gentle even when you are hurt. You learn to be the one who gives the second chance, the third chance, the 10th chance. And somewhere in that pattern, the shadow begins to form. Not because kindness is bad, but because any quality, when overused and disconnected from self-respect, casts a shadow. The shadow of the good person is resentment. The shadow of the rescuer is exhaustion. The shadow of the endlessly understanding one is a deep, private rage that says, I am tired of being the only one who sees this clearly. That rage may not arrive as shouting. Often it arrives as numbness, as a quiet refusal, as the sudden inability to perform warmth on command. As the day you stop replying with the same speed, the same softness, the same hope. And then the guilt comes. Of course it does. Because guilt is often the alarm that sounds when a long-standing role begins to collapse. If you were praised for being the one who never made things difficult, then the moment you become difficult to use, your psyche may interpret that as danger. Not moral danger, psychological danger. The danger of no longer belonging to the old system. This is where the persona matters. The persona is the face we show to the world. It is not fake in the childish sense. It is necessary. We all need a way to function socially. But when the persona becomes too rigid, too identified with, it starts to dictate our worth. The good one, the easy one, the selfless one, the strong one, the understanding one, can become cages with beautiful names. And cages are especially hard to leave when people admire the bars. They say you are so patient. They say you are so mature. They say you are so calm. What they often mean is, you are so convenient. That is a painful sentence, but it is worth hearing clearly. Because convenience is not love. Convenience is not devotion. Convenience is not emotional safety. And if someone only knows how to relate to the version of you that never interrupts their comfort, then your silence becomes a mirror. It shows them something they did not want to see, that your presence was never guaranteed, only tolerated when useful. Now, this does not mean every person who reacts badly to your silence is manipulative. Human beings are messy. People get scared. People misread. People feel abandoned when a familiar pattern changes. But if you keep returning to the same emotional loop, if every boundary you set is treated like betrayal, if every need you express is framed as too much, then it is worth asking a deeper question. What exactly has been held together by your self-erasure? Because that is the real wound. Not just that someone is distant, not just that they do not understand, not just that they keep taking more than they give. The real wound is the part of you that learned to call this love. And here, Jung becomes very useful, because he never lets us stay at the surface. He would ask, what in you is being projected outward? What image of love you are carrying? What inner wound is being activated by the other person's behavior? What familiar emotional pattern is being reenacted under a new name? Projection is one of the most painful and most ordinary human experiences. We do it all the time. We place our inner expectations, fears, and longings onto someone else. Then we suffer as if they are the source of the whole drama. In relationships, this can become especially intense. You may not only love the person in front of you, you may also be loving the possibility they awaken, the fantasy of being chosen, the hope that if you are patient enough, gentle enough, understanding enough, they will finally become the person who makes all your effort make sense. But sometimes, what you are attached to is not the person. It is the meaning you assign to them. That is why silence hurts so much, because silence removes the fantasy's soundtrack. It leaves you alone with what is actually there. And what is actually there may be much smaller than what you imagined, or much more uncomfortable. A person who benefits from your overgiving may not want your silence because it interrupts the arrangement. Your quiet removes the constant invitation to take without meeting you halfway. Your refusal to chase creates a vacuum where your old role used to stand. And that vacuum can feel unbearable to someone who depended on you being emotionally available on demand. But again, your silence is not punishment. Punishment wants to hurt. Boundary wants to protect. Punishment says, I will make you pay. Boundary says, I am no longer available for this pattern. There is a huge difference. And if you can feel that difference in your body, you are already beginning to leave the old story. You may notice that the body knows before the mind does. The stomach tightens when you read the message. The shoulders rise when you think about replying. The jaw locks when you imagine explaining yourself again. The chest feels heavy when you picture going back to the version of you that was always trying to keep the peace. That body wisdom matters, because the psyche often tries to rationalize what the body has already rejected. You tell yourself, maybe I'm overreacting, but your body says, I am tired. You tell yourself, maybe I should just be more understanding, but your body says, I am not safe in this pattern. You tell yourself, maybe if I say it gently enough, they will finally get it. But your body says, I have said enough. This is where the old complex starts to loosen. A complex is not just a thought. It is a knot of emotion, memory, and expectation that gets activated by certain situations. If you have an abandonment complex, silence can feel like a cliff edge. If you have a rescuer complex, other people's distress can feel like an emergency you must solve. If you have a guilt complex, any act of self-protection can feel like wrongdoing. These complexes are powerful because they do not operate like logic. They operate like emotional gravity. That is why you can know, intellectually, that you need a boundary and still feel sick when you set one. That is why you can know someone is draining you and still feel responsible for their reaction. That is why you can stop answering and still hear an inner voice saying, you are being selfish. But listen carefully. Selfishness is not the same as selfhood. A selfish act ignores the humanity of others. A boundary honors the humanity of both people, including your own. If you are always the one who absorbs discomfort so that someone else never has to sit with theirs, then your kindness has crossed into self-betrayal. And self-betrayal, repeated long enough, becomes a kind of inner poverty. You may still look generous from the outside, but inside you are emptying out. That emptiness often becomes visible only when you stop. When you stop explaining, the silence reveals the imbalance. When you stop over-functioning, the relationship reveals its structure. When you stop carrying the emotional weather, you see who knows how to stand on their own, and who only knows how to lean. This is not about becoming hard, it is about becoming honest. And honesty can feel brutal when you have lived inside a mask for too long. The mask says, I'm fine. The mask says, I understand. The mask says, it's okay. The mask says, I don't need much. But the self, the deeper center Jung spoke of, does not live by those phrases forever. The self has its own timing. It begins to press against the false arrangement. It sends discomfort, restlessness, silence, fatigue, a strange inability to keep performing the old role. Sometimes the self does not arrive as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as refusal. You stop answering because something in you finally says no more. You do not know exactly how to explain it. You only know that your spirit has become too crowded. That is not coldness. That is individuation beginning. Individuation is not becoming superior. It is not a spiritual costume. It is the slow process of becoming more whole, less split between what you feel and what you perform. And often, the first sign of individuation is that you can no longer keep sacrificing your center to preserve outer peace. That is why your silence may feel so unfamiliar. You are not just withholding a reply. You are withdrawing energy from a pattern that fed on your automatic yes. And once that energy is withdrawn, the dynamic changes. The other person may become more attentive, or more confused, or more defensive, or more absent. Sometimes the reaction is subtle, a delayed response, a colder tone. A sudden attempt to re-engage once they sense the old access is no longer guaranteed. But do not rush to interpret every movement as proof of love or proof of loss. That is another trap. When you are emotionally depleted, you can start reading every shift as fate. A message becomes a sign. Silence becomes a verdict. A small gesture becomes meaning you can build a house on. But if you want to understand the pattern, you have to slow down and ask, what exactly is being touched here? My reality or my longing? There is a difference, and that difference is where your power returns. Because the moment you stop asking, how do I make them understand my silence? And begin asking, what is my silence protecting? Everything becomes cleaner. Maybe it is protecting your time. Maybe it is protecting your nervous system. Maybe it is protecting your dignity. Maybe it is protecting the part of you that is tired of being the emotional adult in every room. Maybe it is protecting your ability to feel desire again, because constant overgiving has made you numb. Maybe it is protecting you from a pattern that keeps asking for more of you than it ever intends to return. That is not punishment. That is wisdom. And wisdom is often quiet. A woman or man who has finally learned to respect their own energy does not need to announce every boundary with drama. They do not need to threaten, explain, or perform moral superiority. They simply stop volunteering for what keeps them small. The first time you do this, guilt may rise like a wave. That is normal. It does not mean you are wrong. It means you are breaking a contract your nervous system once believed was necessary for belonging. And here is where the deeper layer appears. Sometimes, the person you are afraid of losing is not actually the person in front of you. It is the identity you built around being needed by them. The one who is indispensable, the one who can be counted on, the one who makes the relationship function, the one who can endure more than anyone else. Letting go of that identity can feel like grief, because in some strange way, it gave you structure. Even suffering can become familiar enough to feel like home. That is why silence can be so transformative. It interrupts the familiar loop. It creates space for a different question to emerge. Not, how do I keep this person? But, who am I when I stop performing for connection? If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. I am allowed to protect my peace without calling it cruelty. Read that slowly. Your boundary does not need to be beautiful to be real. It does not need to be perfectly timed. It does not need to be understood by everyone who benefited from your lack of one. And if someone only respects you when you are overextended, then their version of closeness was always dependent on your depletion. That is a hard truth, but it frees you from a lot of confusion. Because then you no longer have to ask whether your silence is making you unkind. You can ask whether your speech was costing you too much. You no longer have to wonder if you are becoming distant. You can notice whether you were already disappearing while trying to stay close. This is where the symbol of the closed door matters. Not a slammed door, not a dramatic exit, just a door that no longer stays half open to everyone by default. A half-open door invites confusion. It says maybe. It says come in and take what you want, but please do not make me ask for too much. It says I am available, but only if you do not notice how tired I am. A closed door is different. A closed door is clear. It says I am here, but I am not porous. It says access must be earned. It says I will not confuse your comfort with my consent. And for someone who has lived with an open door for too long, that clarity can feel almost shocking. You may even mourn the version of yourself that used to be easier to reach. But remember, easier for whom? The shadow of the good one is often the silent accumulation of unmet needs. The shadow of the empath is not evil. It is the part that is fed up with being endlessly generous toward people who do not know how to hold generosity with care. When that shadow finally speaks, it may sound blunt. It may sound cold. It may sound like distance. But underneath it, there is often a very simple message. I am no longer available to be consumed. That message does not need to be shouted to be true. And if you are afraid that setting this boundary will make you lose love, then ask yourself honestly, what kind of love required your disappearance in the first place? That question changes the ground beneath your feet, because real closeness does not require self-erasure. Real closeness can handle a pause. It can handle a no. It can handle your nervous system asking for space. It can handle your humanity. Anything less may not be love. It may be dependence, convenience, habit, or control wearing a softer face. Jung's language helps here because he understood how easily we mistake inner images for outer reality. We see someone through the lens of our own longing. We project onto them qualities they may not actually embody. We imagine depth where there is only familiarity. We imagine rescue where there is only repetition. We imagine that if we are patient enough, our devotion will transform the pattern. But devotion that costs you your center is not sacred. It is a loop. And the loop ends when you stop feeding it. Not because you become superior, not because you become cold, but because you finally see the cost clearly enough to choose otherwise. Your silence, then, becomes a form of truth-telling. Not loud truth, not theatrical truth. The kind that lives in the nervous system. The kind that says, I am no longer negotiating with the part of myself that knows this is not enough. That may be the most important moment in the whole story. Because once you know, you cannot unknow. You may still feel tempted. You may still miss them. You may still want to explain. You may still have days when the old guilt returns and asks if perhaps you were too harsh, too distant, too unavailable. That does not mean you failed. Healing is not a straight line. Boundary work is not a clean switch. Sometimes you will feel strong in the morning and shaky at night. Sometimes you will hold your line for a week and then feel the old habit tug at you. That is not proof that the boundary was wrong. It is proof that the pattern was deep. And deep patterns do not dissolve because we understand them once. They loosen through repetition, through reflection, through the body learning that peace is not dangerous. The next time you feel that guilt rise, notice what it is trying to protect. Is it protecting your values, or is it protecting your old role? Is it pointing to real harm, or is it trying to drag you back into being useful at the expense of being whole? That distinction matters, because the mature self does not say yes automatically. It pauses, it checks the body, it checks the motive. It asks whether the response is coming from love, fear, habit, or hope. And sometimes, the most loving response is no response. Not forever, not as a weapon, just enough silence to let your inner world breathe again. Silence can be a punishment when it is used to control. Silence can be avoidance when it is used to disappear. But silence can also be a boundary when it is used to protect what is still tender in you. That is the silence worth honoring. The silence that says, I do not need to prove my pain to deserve care. The silence that says, I am done chasing clarity from people who profit from my confusion. The silence that says, my peace is not negotiable anymore. And if someone notices the change, let them notice it. If they feel the distance, let them feel it. If they suddenly understand what they had only when it was easy, that is part of their journey, not yours. Your journey is simpler now. You are learning to stay with yourself. You are learning that a boundary is not a wall against love. It is a way of making love real enough to survive contact with the truth. You are learning that the mask can come off without your life falling apart. You are learning that the person who always explained herself was not weak, only overburdened. You are learning that the quiet version of you is not empty. She is listening. And what she is listening for is no longer the next demand, the next apology, the next emotional crisis to solve. She is listening for her own center. For the first time in a long time, she hears it. It is not loud. It does not perform. It does not beg to be chosen. It simply stands there, calm and unmistakable, like a closed door in a room that used to have none. And from that place, you do not need to punish anyone. You do not need to explain your worth. You do not need to turn your silence into a performance. You only need to keep returning to the part of you that knows the difference between being loved and being available for consumption. That return is the boundary. That return is the healing. That return is you, no longer abandoning yourself in order to stay inside someone else's comfort. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Say that quietly to yourself. Let it settle. And if the old guilt comes back tonight, as it sometimes does, do not panic. Just notice it like a familiar shadow at the edge of the room. It is not your enemy. It is a sign that you are standing somewhere new. You are not punishing. You are protecting. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming clear. And clear love begins where self-abandonment ends.